Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to today's informative seminar, whose purpose is to discuss climate change and carbon neutrality. This webinar is part of a year-long cycle of webinars and conferences called Green, Smart, Resilient and Inclusive Cities. This cycle brings you Czech Infrastructure Association in cooperation with the Czech unions and towns. We have prepared it with the Czech Business Council for Sustainable Development and Union of Businessmen in Civil Engineering and Construction Industry of the Czech and Slovak Republic. My connection seems to be slow today. However, let me continue. We've prepared this cycle also in cooperation with the Ministry for Regional Development, Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Industry and Trade. The purpose of the cycle is to provide a series of webinars, debates, conferences. Last Tuesday, we had the first webinar on the European Grill for Europe and digital transformation. Next week, we shall discuss ESG taxonomy and sustainable financing. We shall also have roundtables where we will discuss various topics such as electromobility versus urban environment, how to become carbon neutral. We shall discuss developments in heating industry, etc. Particular topics to be discussed are covered by experts from Matt McDonald, Enviros, PwC and Havel and Partners Legal Office. Our main partners, and we'd like to thank them for their support, is British Embassy in Prague, European Investment Bank, CSOB, Strabag, and two largest design engineering offices, Valbeck and Sudokru. All information that you see and hear during our discussions will be available at www.zelenamesta.cz, where there we store all information that might be of interest for you. Today's topic is climate change and carbon neutrality. Why cities? Cities will continue to play an important role in our combat with the climate change. Cities consume 70% of global energy. They create or generate over 80% of greenhouse gases worldwide. In the future, cities will play an important role in solving the issue of climate change. You, mayors of towns and municipalities, are directly responsible to your electorate. You are more agile, and the results of your work can be seen immediately, and they are very efficient. Local actions can have immediate impact, and they together can create a global effect. From our point of view, cities have the power to change the world. And I do apologize For certain technical issues, my presentation seems to be jumping from one slide to another. So in the past 30 years, we've managed to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases by 35%, which is a huge victory, an important victory. Here you can see that the total result comprises 80% decrease in combustion in industry and 60% in households. There has been a major change in agriculture, energy, industry, and a global trend, and it's an interesting piece of information. Transport increased by 69% globally. So we went down by 35%. Still, the Czech Republic is the fourth largest emittent of greenhouse gases per capita in Europe, which means that the quality of air in the Czech Republic is an issue. In 2018, 40% of emissions came from energy, comprising 35% of power, 10% heating, 18% combustion, 16% transport, and 13% industry. This is an interesting slide depicting the quality of air in Europe. There are notable differences between Eastern and Western Europe and Northern and Southern Europe. If we observe all those best practices that we shall hear about today, we hopefully will be able to improve our air to make it similar to that in the Western countries. The quality of air in cities is a problem, as shown by recent research by the Barcelona Institute. 16 Czech cities belongs to 250 European cities with the largest concentration of dust particles in air. If we manage to introduce relevant measures, we can prevent up to 2,600 deaths per year. This is yet another outcome of the research showing that polluted air causes medical problems, and there are 3 Czech countries among the European cities where there are enormous numbers of deaths due to polluted air. But there are not only medical problems involved. Change of climate imposes also an economic problem. It poses a risk to our budgets as well. The Czech Republic has suffered major losses due to climate change, equal to 330 billion Czech crowns. If recalculated to the parity of purchasing power, we perhaps might be a sad leader of this chart. And these losses are not only agricultural, they represent also losses to the infrastructure. So that's all from me, and I shall pass the microphone to Mr. Petr Kalaš.
Thanks for the word, Tomáš. Good morning to everyone. On behalf of the Czech Business Council for Sustainable Development, let me welcome you to today's webinar. The Czech Business Council is a member of the World Business Council, and it is present in the Government Council for Sustainable Development. It gathers businesses focusing on sustainable development principles at both the societal and business level. And Mott MacDonald is also one of the members of our group. In the working groups, we focus on the topics of smart cities, green cities, clean mobility, circular economy, post-COVID development, etc. And we have a number of experienced experts from these fields. To introduce the climate change, I would like to say that the climate agenda, both the climate change and the mitigation of these changes and adaptation to the climate change, will be performed through cities and towns and will have an impact on their future development. The COVID pandemic is an urgent and let's hope that a short-term challenge, but climate is a very topical issue and it has a long-term impact on us. Let me remind you some of these issues. The climate change represents a global challenge, and if we are to resolve it, we need global and joint efforts. Since the Kyoto Protocol in 2008, there have been huge efforts, and in Paris in 2015, 180 countries agreed that we have to keep the pace of the global warming under 2 degrees centigrade compared to the pre-industrial era. And we should stick to about 1.5 degrees centigrade to prevent irreversible climate changes. What is this based on? This is an interconnection between global warming and the density of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere, which is produced mainly by combustion of fossil fuels. We know that we need to use a concerted effort of the states, and the nations have adopted voluntary commitments to reduce greenhouse emissions. This will lead us to the net zero. The Czech Republic is also one of the signatories of the Paris Agreement, and the Czech Republic has also become a part of the Green Climate Fund, the largest investment fund supporting climate projects in developing countries. It is important that the national commitments have been adopted by China, India, Russia, and it's great that also the activities of the United States have come back to the Paris Agreement. It is interesting that despite the minor part in the emissions by about 9%, Europe is becoming the leader in these initiatives. For example, national goals have been adopted. They are long-term and short-term goals. For example, increasing the share of renewable energy in the energy mix. This also includes lowering the energy intensity. These decarbonization efforts require a reduction of emissions of greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to the level of 1990 and carbon neutrality by 2050. The long-term transition to carbon neutrality is the so-called European Green Deal. This is a 30-year global transition going to the goal of carbon neutrality. It will be linked to a huge development of digitization. The green funds, which have been presented at the previous webinar, will also be used for this development. They will be part of the implementation of these efforts throughout Europe. Nation states have committed to develop their climate plans by 2030. The towns play a very essential role in this. As has been said, the cities will become major contributors to decarbonization. At the European level, there are various levels, the various programs, for example, the carbon neutral cities, and it would be advisable for the Czech Republic to participate in these programs. As has been said, the Czech Republic has reduced its emissions over the past 20 years. But the Czech Republic is still the fourth largest producer of CO2 emissions per year, which is 50% more than the European average. Our share in the European emissions is about 3%. And the major emission sources, as has been said by Tomáš, is the energy sector, industry, but also buildings and agriculture. If we want to commit to reduce emissions by 2030 by 55%, it would mean a yearly reduction of emissions by about 3.3%. It's 3.2% to be quite correct. That's a very fundamental and ambitious goal. On the other hand, McKinsey company showed that in the Czech environment, this is possible. It is technically feasible, and from the economical viewpoint, it would mean investing about 1% of our GDP. Decarbonization in the Czech Republic will be mainly implemented by reduction of the use of coal in the energy and heat sector, but also in industrial and building sectors. The residential sector is a special challenge for cities, towns and municipalities because the use of coal in this area leads to poor quality of air and worse quality of life. Measures taken in the areas of transport and other areas will complement this Czech commitment. What I would like to talk about is the current recovery of the attitude towards the environmentally friendly and climate agenda. We used to be skeptical previously, but we have seen many weather extremes. And that is why the Czech population started to tackle the climate issues. There has been apparent shift in the attitude of Czech population. We have to support these efforts by the Innovation Fund. There has been a call to submit applications for the projects using green funds. And we have seen a tremendous result. More than 8,000 applicants filed submissions or applications for projects for photovoltaic use. These were especially photovoltaic panels used on roofs. There has also been a great interest in refurbishment of heating plants, and there have been many projects aiming at the reduction of the energy use in industry. There has been a recent conference by the Czech Technical University, and more than 25,000 participants wanted to see the conference. So this shows the great interest. What are the possibilities of the transition to carbon neutrality? It's all about energy, about local production of energy and heat. It's the decentralized heating, support to renewables, but also use of alternative fuel products. For example, using waste or biomaterials. Let me also say that there is a decarbonization commitment for towns and municipalities, and that there is a link to a huge international program, which is the Pact of Mayors. I'm not sure whether you can see it. This is basically a methodology helping cities and towns to adopt commitments for the future. This program supports mainly reduction of energy intensity, which brings many positive things in the area of the environment. If we want to mitigate the climate change, there is a methodology called the way to resilience, from vulnerability to resilience, and it shows how to tackle all the challenges and issues. To conclude, I would like to say that for towns and municipalities, the climate change means to become aware of the fact that it is necessary to adopt the transition approach in our agenda. We should be proactive in tackling the climate change, and we have to reflect it in our development strategies. We have to use the climate agenda and the support of the green funds and use it as a unique opportunity to transform the development areas in a sustainable manner. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Petr Dovolil. I am with Mott MacDonald and have been involved in the area of climate change and how to achieve carbon neutrality. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Petr Kalaš and Tomáš Janeba. They both have introduced the topic of carbon neutrality from a slightly different viewpoint. Tomáš focused on medical aspects. Petr Kalaš discussed the EU context and the global context, including discussions that are ahead in the Czech Republic. Because we want you to have practical information how Czech countries can get involved in this topic. I may seem as a tutor now or a teacher because I'll be summing up some information, but we shall see how the environment will change and how Czech cities can react to that. We shall discuss best practices from all around the world and how these challenges are tackled in the world surrounding us. Let's start with my presentation now. Yes. My presentation is called Climate Change and Carbon Neutrality in European Green Deal with Relevance for Czech Cities. This is an introductory seminar, the first one, and therefore, because the objective of carbon neutrality is the main objective of the European Green Deal, we decided to start with that particular topic. My presentation does not seem to work. I do apologize for the inconvenience. Next slide, please. My presentation has got 4 parts. Then we shall have a discussion. Kindly use www.zelenaměsta.cz, Facebook and LinkedIn to pose your questions. First of all, I'll have a brief introduction, then we shall discuss strategy and legislation, then the European Climate Pact, and then we'll have Q&A session. Next slide, please. Well, why should we take any action? There has been an irreversible trend of climate change. Just to let you know, at the beginning of last century, there were 1.6 billion people living on planet Earth. Now, there are some 7.8 billion people. We've been measuring concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. We've already heard about the objective of 1.5 degrees centigrade. So there is a small reserve of 420 gigatons to achieve that goal. So the curves that you see on the slide, what is ahead of us? We should step on the brake in a very dynamic way because carbon and climate represent an equation, and we've entered that equation in a way, and it will react to us, and the reactions will be costly. So to solve the issue of carbon is something that can be attached a value to, and we should know how these trends can be reverted in the future. Next slide, please. It's important to know that in autumn of this year, there will be yet another summit of European countries, a conference on climate change in Glasgow in November 2021. And perhaps it will outline a global solution, starting from those that Petr Kalash mentioned, because the last conference was held in Paris in 2015. This chart shows a curve of emissions. They had been growing up, they had doubled. And this trend, if it continues, would definitely irreversibly change the climate on this planet. So the European Union has arrived to the agreement, which is called the European Green Deal, adopted in late 2019. It contains ambitious goal of improving the situation both in the EU while contributing to the global solution. It's an initial plan of politics, strategies and solutions to which particular measures are attached. And the climate change is one of those 12 topics that are included in the European Green Deal. There are more policies such as digitization of Europe, introduction of digital policies. There is a new Leipzig Charter, new urban development strategy, and since last December, there has been a new territorial strategy or agenda. And all these four plans constitute a framework within which climate change shall be discussed and tackled further. Just very briefly, we can see four most fundamental goals of the new holistic 30-year growth strategy. We should not look only on financial sustainability, but also economic and social. By 2050, Europe shall have become a climate neutral territory, protecting human life, animals and plants, full of companies who are world leaders in clean products and technologies, and we should also help ensure a just and inclusive transition. The EU has the capability to transform its ability, and 30% of the next EU budget shall be spent on mitigation and adaptation to the climate change. Next slide, please. In the second block, I'd like to discuss strategies and legislation pertaining to climate change because they will alter the framework and it will pose some requirements not only on municipalities and their management, but also industrial facilities and businessmen living in the cities, including residents and civil society. And it's very important that everyone perceives this opportunity as a chance, and it's the only chance we have. The Czech Republic committed to dealing with the issue, and it will be important for further development of the Czech Republic. And there are many risks and opportunities involved. In 2018, a document was published, Clean Planet for All. Then the European Green Deal followed. And in March 2020, the first European climate law was proposed, and I shall get back to it later. It stipulates how the European Union and its member states should proceed to be able to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. There has been many activities, as obvious from the figures on the slide. Between 1990 and 2018, greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced by 23%, while the economy went up by 61%. So as you see, we can succeed. So what came next? In terms of mitigation, Commission set a goal of reducing by 55% compared with 1990 levels. In December 2020, it was approved, and now we are waiting for a document by the EU enshrining this goal. There will be some more legal acts published that will govern the field of carbon regulation in Europe. All existing climate-related political documents will be reviewed. The system of emissions trading will be reviewed, including a possible extension to new sectors and outside of sectors. We will also review regulation on land use change and forestry. So perhaps the legal framework will be more strict, will impact all shareholders in a more stricter way, and we will have to take it very seriously because for the future all these changes will have to be reflected in funding schemes and budgets.
To, co je zásadní pro Českou republiku, je, že ačkoliv nemá
What's
svůj vlastní
important
zákon
for the
o
Czech
změně
Republic? The
klimatu,
Czech Republic
jsou
does
jiný
not have
země, jako
its
je
own
Kanada,
law on climate
Francie,
change, unlike
Dánsko,
other
či
countries
Maďarsko,
such as
tak
Great
bude
Britain, Denmark, or
vlastně
Hungary.
povinna v rámci nařízení, to znamená přímo působícího právního
So
předpisu
there
Evropské
will
unie,
be
realizovat opatření
it will
s
be
cílem dosažení
implementing
uhlíkové neutrality do roku
climate measures
2050.
under the EU
Kde je
regulation
důvod
with the purpose of achieving
toho nařízení,
carbon
kdy
neutrality
je
by
jasně stanoveno, že emise a povolování
2050.
skleníkových plynů v rámci Unie
The
jsou
EU
upraveny právem Unie, musí být letos do
clearly
roku 2050
stipulates
vyrovnané, a to se do
that
uvedeného data emise sníží o
by
100 nul.
2050, we shall achieve net zero by reducing emissions. And the European Union is now preparing the steps to assist the member states to achieve that goal by 2050. And the Czech Republic still has major challenges lying ahead. It's very important that a price will have to be attached to carbon. In the United Kingdom, when preparing, designing projects, the right price of carbon is discussed. Maria, my colleague, will speak about what's going on in the United Kingdom, how particular stakeholders deal with this requirement. It's also important to see the outcome of the review of the Energy Taxation Directive. The prices of energy will continue to be affected by certain EU level steps that are in place to support our transfer to carbon-less economy. Also, it's important not to export carbon outside of the EU. The EU has been preparing some mechanisms concerning carbon border adjustment, and it will be a fight, but there is no other way but to govern the space outside of the EU, adjust imports of goods and services because we'd like to avoid certain asymmetries. We don't want EU businessmen being under certain difficulties and those from the outside having no responsibilities at all. Next slide, please.
It is also important to say something that Petr Kalaš has already mentioned. The second part of the climate change issue is about being prepared for the unbalanced states that we have seen very frequently and which have an impact on the financial sector. The financial sector is very sensitive to the adaptation to the climate change, and there is a set of rules that they will start implementing. This is because the amount that is linked to the extremes and abnormal developments in the world keeps increasing. And this issue is starting to be a risk for the whole financial sector. The European Union has issued a new strategy regarding this problem. This was at the end of February. And this will be also a framework of the strategies for the Czech Republic in the upcoming years. We will shortly also have our own Czech strategy that will transpose the EU strategy. An important part of this is the EU taxonomy, which you will see on the next slide. The EU taxonomy is something absolutely fundamental for the future development and for the correction of the rules of play within the EU. Just to give you an idea, the EU taxonomy is a sort of classification system. It is set of various business activities, and for each activities, it is said whether they are green or sustainable or not. This should give us a certain orientation in the various sectors, and this should enable the businesses to invest according to clear rules of the play. These rules use to originate naturally, and EU taxonomy is within the so-called ESG standards, which also impose other goals than only the financial revenue. They also imposed the environmental, social, and other goals, governance safeguards, for example. Uh, the EU taxonomy imposes criteria according to which you can identify whether your business activity is sustainable or not. The legal framework has already been available.
celé je založené na tom, že ty zelené udržitelné
Green
aktivity by měly
sustainable
přispívat
activities
alespoň
should
€1,600
substantially contribute to at least
prostředí,
one of the
z nichž
6 EU
jedna je
environmental
citlivým znakem
objectives. One
roku,
of them is
druhá
climate change
přizpůsobení se změnám
mitigation, second one,
klimatu,
climate change
třetí je udržitelné
adaptation, third,
využití
sustainable
alternativy,
use and protection of
páté
water,
přechodná ozónově
four,
hospodářství,
transition to a
páté
circular
prevence
economy,
omezování
five,
znečištění,
pollution
šesté
prevention and
ochrana
control, and
biodiverzity a
six, protection
ekosystémů.
and restoration of
Důležitý je,
biodiversity
že
and
jedna,
ecosystems.
aby ta
What is
činnost byla
important
označena
is
jako
that
trvale udržitelná, tak
for
musí
the
podstatně
activity to
přispívat k
be
jednomu z těchto třech
sustainable,
cílů.
it must
Zároveň
contribute
ale
to
nesmí
one of
škodit
these
úplně jiným
objectives, but
ekologickým
at the
cílům
same time, it
a
must
musí
not
splňovat
significantly
alespoň
harm other
minimální pravidla
environmental
týkající se
objectives, and
sociální
it
ochrany
has to
a
comply
zprávy.
with minimum social and governance safeguards.
A bude splňovat tedy robustní
It
technická
also has to
kritéria
comply
posuzování
with
zelených
robust and
energetických zátěží.
science-based technical
Chystá
screening
se vydání dvou
criteria.
speciální sady pro
An
ty
official
první dvě
set
technické sady
for
z
the
těch screeningových
first
kritérií
two
pro climate,
criteria
pozměnění změn
is being
klimatu,
prepared
přizpůsobení se změnám
for the climate
klimatu,
change
bude
mitigation and
poměrně
climate
brzy,
change
jak nám Unie
adaptation.
sdělil
And
Martin
in
Schulz z Evropské komise, by
mid-April,
měly vydány
as we have been told
konečné
by
verze
Mr. Spolz from the
těchto
European
kritérií.
Commission, the
Je to
next
zásadní pro
criteria should
investování
be
do budoucna,
published. This is
protože
important for
některé
investments in
programy
future
Evropské
because
unie
certain
budou
EU
svázány
programs will
s
be tightly
podmínkou,
linked
že
to a
mají tedy
condition
jak zelený,
that
tak v
the
určitém rozsahu
project
zelený.
must be
To znamená, toto je
sustainable or
naprosto
green.
zásadní nový
So this is
nástroj,
a
který opravdu
fundamental
se bude
tool that
využívat
will be
a je
used in
zřejmé, že bude
future, and it is
využíván i
evident
k
that
novým
it will be
alternativním
used
nástrojům
for
financování
alternative financing
municipalit a
instruments
průmyslových
used by
podniků formou
municipalities,
zelených
but also
dluhopisů. Důležité
businesses
také je připomenout,
for the
že
EU Green
tento
Bond
standard se
standards.
nebude zabývat pouze
This standard
environmentálními
will not
aspekty
only speak
hospodářské
about the
činnosti, ale
environmental
počítá se,
aspects of
že do
business
konce roku
activities, but
2021
by
Evropská
the end
unie
of
vydá sadu
2021,
sociálních
the European Union
kritérií,
should
tak aby
also issue a
donutila
social
vlastně, aby
KPIs,
celý ten systém investování v
ensuring
rámci
that the
Evropské
whole
unie postupně
financing system within
začínal
the EU
zahrnovat i sociální
includes
aspekty
also
a vydávat
social
sociální
aspects
výsledky.
and
Další slide.
provides social results. Next slide, please.
Tady jenom jsem chtěl ukázat krátký přehled toho, co
This
už
is just a short
Evropská
list or
komise
overview of
vydala, respektive měla vydat. Na tom
the
prvním
documents
slajdu
already
jsou
issued
označeny tři dokumenty nebo tři skupiny
by the
dokumentů,
European
které ještě
Union. You
zbývají
can
vydat.
see
Já jsem se
three
o nich už
other
zmínil.
groups
Jsou to
of
návrhy na revizi
documents
příslušných
which should
legislativních
be
opatření
issued.
s
For
cílem
example,
dosáhnout zvýšené ambice v oblasti klimatu, návaznosti na
some of
přizpůsobení
the
se
measures
systému
to
chování s
deliver the
emisemi.
increased
To
climate
znamená, bude
ambition.
zásah do toho systému, regulaci o sdílení úsilí, regulace využití půdy,
For
změny
example, this
využití
should
půdy
be
a
the
lesnictví,
review of emissions
směrnice o
trading system
energetické
directive,
účinnosti,
effort sharing
směrnice o
regulation,
obnovitelné
land use, land
energii,
use change and
směrnice
forestry
nebo směrnice
regulation,
o
energy efficiency
kulturních
directive,
památkách
renewable
kultury.
energy directive,
Druhou
CO2 emissions
postoupenou jsou
performance
jenom
standards for
směrnice
cars
o
and
odnárodnění
vans.
energie, o kterém jsem se už
The
zmínil.
second
A
group of
třetí je návrh
documents is
mechanismu
the
na
revision
správu
of the
podniků
Energy
hranic
Taxation
uhlíkové stopy.
Directive
Všechny
and
ostatní
the proposal for a
dokumenty,
carbon
které
border
budou
adjustment
přílohou
mechanism
Zelené
for
dohody o
selected
Europetu, jsou
sectors.
vydány. Tyto nová
All of the other
kritéria pro
documents have
přizpůsobování se
already
změně
been
klimatu.
issued.
Další slide.
Can we see the next slide, please?
Je to investiční plán Zelené dohody pro Evropu
This
a
is the
mechanismus pro
European Green Deal
spravedlivou
investment plan
transformaci.
and the just
Ten byl
transition
představen
mechanism. This
detaily
has
i v České
already been
republice
presented, and in the
podle
Czech
jeho konkrétního
Republic,
plánu. Návrh
specific
Evropského
plans are
klimatického
being
zákona, o něm
devised.
jsem se
Proposal for
zmínil,
a European
je k
climate law, I
dispozici
have
od
mentioned
března
that. It is
minulého roku
available
a
since March last year.
má být vydán prostřednictvím nařízení Evropské unie.
And a regulation of the European Union should be issued, which is linked to this. There is the new European Industrial Strategy, Circular Economy Action Plan, Farm to Fork Strategy, and EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. The EU also has a strategy for energy system integration and hydrogen. Various acts were already approved linked to specific areas of decarbonization, such as Renovation Way, focusing on buildings, methane strategy or chemicals strategy, offshore renewable energy, the European Climate Pact, the European Battery Alliance. And there is also the proposal to reduce EU greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. This is just to show you what is going on at the European level. So for you, towns and villages, this is very useful, and this will have an important strategic impact for you. So it's good to know all these documents. Before discussion, let me also say a few words about the Climate Pact. This pact allows towns, municipalities, but also citizens and businesses to participate in looking for the pan-European solution. This is a EU-wide initiative inviting people, communities, and organizations to participate in climate action and build a greener Europe. It is evident that we need to achieve the goals by negotiating at the level of citizens, at the level of communities, because this will ensure climate neutrality with regard to improving health care, but also the situation in, in the climate change. In the right part of the slide, you can see that 93% of Europeans see climate change as a serious problem. Quite recently, in the Czech Republic, we have seen the impacts of the climate change over the past 10 years. We could all see that there were very warm summers. These were rather hot summers, and we have seen similar development in the rest of the world, because since 2009 to 2019, we have experienced the hottest decade over the past 40 we have seen this very clear trend, and we have seen the impacts which were fundamental in 2019 and led us to take many steps. So these developments contribute to this fundamental development. And in recent years, we have seen, for example, the videos from Australia, which have experienced a large flooding. We have to use our intelligence and our skills to change our behavior. This helps us prevent many problems in future.
Další slide. Ohledně prioritních oblastí klimatického paktu.
What are the priority areas, focus areas of the climate pact? There are 4 such areas: green areas, green transport, green buildings, and green skills. In future, there should be more such areas. There is a special website devoted to the European Climate Pact, and if you are from a town authority, you can look at this website and see how it's possible to achieve the climate change goals by 2050. Now we have space for your questions. But before we start discussion, I would like to show you through this slide what has changed as regards financing and investments. In the past, costs were the primary factor for investments, but now what becomes very important is the cost and the time with connection to the climate change. And it's usually up to the responsibility of the investor to also look at the social aspects of the projects. I have already mentioned that we want to have a digital and smart and clean environment, providing social benefits as well. So we should always be looking at the link between the environmental, social, and the governance factors. And in future, we will definitely focus on digital and smart solutions. The first question: what do you think are the most important voluntary instruments at the level of businesses to mitigate climate change? The industry is the largest producer of emissions. Could these be the ISO standards or other methodologies or GRI, engineering? If we talk about businesses, but also town administrations, I would like to tell you about the international standards such as PAS 2800, and I'm sure that Maria Manidaki will tell you more about this standard. I would also like to mention the carbon import, which is regulated by a specific standard, which is 14,064. And there is also a possibility to get registration according to the PAS 2060. It's important to know how businesses could influence their carbon pathway, and Maria Manidaki is going to tell you more about this. But these issues will be part or there will be important factors for any projects. On the other hand, there are lots of opportunities, especially for towns, to establish cooperation with their citizens and businesses and to devise plans that will support each other, that will be interlinked. For example, a town will make an investment for a combined heat plant, or for example, it will set some decarbonization pathway by 2050. The future development will be about cooperation, and all of the companies should be now aware that their investments in various activities also present a risk of a huge loss of these costs, because it will be an issue for them on how to invest in the carbon and how to sustain this activity in future. We have already started with these initiatives, and you have to focus on all of these aspects with your initiatives. We are quite short of time, so I like to ask my colleague Maria Manidaki, our global technical lead for net zero, to thank Maria for joining us today, and I'm going to pass her the floor. She will tell you about the neutrality and what is the international practice and the best practice, mainly from the UK, which belongs to the global leaders in these initiatives. Thank you.
Peter. Hi everyone, I'm Maria Mandaki from McDonald. I'm from Greece. And I have been working on carbon and infrastructure for many years now. I'm an engineer, and today I would like to give you a flavor of some work we have been doing and I've been seeing in different parts of the world around how to reduce greenhouse gas. Can everyone hear me? Yeah?
Vidíte mě, prosím? Vidíte?
Yeah? Okay.
Vidíte mě tady, děkuji.
We have been working on many sectors of infrastructure
Působíme v mnoha sektorech
globally, from
infrastruktury
energy,
v globálním
transport,
měřítku,
water,
ať už se
building,
poradenství,
environment,
vodohospodářství,
international development, and we
máme
have our
také sekci
advisory
poradenství.
sector. And we're a global engineering
Inženýrská
consultancy,
poradenská
and we
společnost
have been
a
in
působíme
carbon
také
reduction,
v oblasti
as
snižování emisí uhlíku a
I call it
skleníkových
for many years now in the UK, but also many other regions in the world, like the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand. I just want to mention here that we are the first company of our size to have been carbon neutral. We achieved this status last year in 2020, and this fits with our purpose to help achieve the social outcomes in our carbon neutrality status by the Carbon Trust. And I'm going to give you a bit of a flavor of what this journey has been. Okay, bear with me. And today, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of carbon neutrality and net zero. I'm just going to give you some practical steps on how you could link your decarbonization journey. I'm going to give you some practical examples and
uvedu několik praktických příkladů a budu mluvit i o naší vlastní cestě k uhlíkové neutralitě. Ve své prezentaci mám řadu případových
we have worked on,
nevím,
but they're there if we don't have time for you to have a look at.
Ale jsou to projekty, na
Okay, apologies, there is a bit of a delay on my screen, basically. So I'm just going to start with some definitions here.
Začnu tedy několika definicemi.
Bear with me. So when we're talking about, sorry, I'm really sorry about this. It's just that there is a bit of a delay. Okay, so when we're talking about net zero carbon or carbon neutrality, I mean, I have seen those definitions being used interchangeably globally, depending which country, which continent you are. Basically, we're saying, according to the Paris Agreement, all these great things that Peter introduced and our other colleagues earlier, the Paris Agreement basically says that if we were as a globe, basically as the world, to avoid a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we will have to achieve a net zero status by 2050 or carbon neutral status as the world. What does this mean? That means 2050 is going to be an operating environment where all sectors of the economy will have to continue operating in, but all our activities will have to make sure that have no impact on the greenhouse gas emissions on the atmosphere. So there is no atmospheric impacts from our activities. And how do we achieve that? So we have to reduce as much as possible or avoid any emissions, carbon emissions from our economic activities. And there will be some residual emissions, as we call them, left. So for those, what we need to do, we need to sequester them or remove them from the atmosphere. And this is done through land management practices. We call those natural sequestration, where essentially you remove the carbon from the atmosphere through trees or other vegetation and land use changes, or through engineering means like carbon capture, utilization and storage, for example, where you take, for example, the CO2 from a power station and you store it and you pump it normally in deep wells underground. So moving to the next slide. I'm just waiting to see if you can see it because I cannot see it very well. Right, so one of the key messages here, and this is in line with global good practices and policies like the Science-Based Target Initiative. This is a decarbonization hierarchy approach when it comes to carbon neutrality. So we need to make sure that first we reduce or avoid as much as possible any emissions we generate from our activities, irrespective of whether we are an energy sector or transport sector or a city, a building. So we need to use technologies, or for example, in transport, to electrify transport, or for example, have energy efficiency initiatives using digital enablers that Peter mentioned as well, how to optimize our operations. Then the next step, once we've done the first reduce or avoid, is to look at technologies such as renewable energy, hydrogen, or other renewable heat technologies to make sure we avoid the use of fossil fuels. So this is about investing in new technologies. And once we've exhausted that, the last thing we can do is the removals of carbon from the atmosphere, which is, as I mentioned earlier, land use changes through natural sequestration or carbon capture, utilization and storage. So this is the decarbonization hierarchy we'll have to have in mind. I'm changing a slide now, I'm moving on. Hopefully I haven't seen it yet, but bear with me a second. Yeah. So another way of looking at greenhouse gas emissions, this is for some work I did with my colleagues many years ago for the UK Treasury. So this is the equivalent of Ministry of Finance back in 2013. This is the infrastructure carbon review. There are some links there you can access when you get the slides. But the message here is basically that carbon emissions can also be looked at as a proxy for resource efficiency. What does this mean? So when we're building things, being infrastructure or buildings, we're consuming resources, materials or other fuels. So those resources entail some activities to extract the materials, to construct those materials into something, a building or infrastructure. All these activities are associated in one way or another with fossil fuel burn. And these are from the typical manufacturing or construction or operational activities. So by reducing those emissions, if you like, or those resources, that means you can result in lower greenhouse gas emissions, but also reduction in cost. And this is a very important point that can allow you to be a more efficient organization or city or a planning authority if you are to look at carbon in terms of resource efficiency. I'm changing the slide now. Bear with me because it is a bit of a delay. Okay, so when it comes to infrastructure, greenhouse gas emissions, or I use the term, we use carbon as a shorthand. It's not only CO2, it's methane and nitrous oxides and other greenhouse gases, methane, like you can see there. It's quite important when you're planning for a program of work, being at the city scale or a development or infrastructure capital program, that we look at carbon in a similar way we look at cost. We have capital carbon, like capital cost basically, which are the emissions associated with the construction activities of any assets. We have operational carbon, which are the emissions associated with the operation of an asset. Like if you're a water company, for example, the emissions associated with electricity use to pump the water, to treat the water. But when it comes to infrastructure in some sectors, especially transport, we also talk about user carbon. And this user carbon is essentially, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side of a road and a car and a lamp, a street lamp, the user carbon are the emissions associated with the fuel in the car to drive the car, the petrol basically. The capital carbon is the emissions associated with the road, the operational carbon with the light. So it's important to clarify when we're planning for things and measuring carbon to look at this in infrastructure in those different ways. I'm changing slide now. Apologies again. There is a bit of a delay, a lag from my end. But so when we're planning for different options, being a new development, a new road, a new energy system, a new water system, it's important to look at the whole life picture of our options, if you like. And when it comes to whole life, it means that we need to have the capital carbon, which is on the left-hand side, the vertical bars of two options. These are two different options. It's a conceptual diagram. And then the cumulative impact of the operational carbon over the whole life of any investment decision. And it's important to have a whole life view because it may affect the way we choose an option. Like in this case, the blue line has a lower capital carbon, but over the life, it may have higher operational carbon. So it's important to look at the whole life view of the world. Okay, I'm changing a slide now. Okay, so this basically slide is something that we have been working on in infrastructure systems, and it's important to note that when it comes to infrastructure, the difference is a little bit more complicated than individual buildings because it's important to look at it as a system. Here are the main economic infrastructure sectors in an economy, can be in any country in the world. So we're talking about energy, water, telecommunications, waste, transport. It's important to just look at those as a system. When it comes to their decarbonization, we know that all these economic infrastructure sectors, like in the UK, they account for over half of the national emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the country. So it's important to decarbonize those. The main lever or the more important one to decarbonize is obviously energy when we're talking about installing more renewables. But actually, all these economic infrastructure sectors that they have asset owners in them, they have to do common things like to reduce their emissions as fast as possible, like the energy they use, or to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, or even look at removals, like if they have any land availability, any asset owners, they can use this land to start changing land use practices and remove the carbon. But it's very, very important to see that it would be very, very expensive if only the energy sector and the electricity grid had the burden to decarbonize the whole economy. So that's why it's important to find opportunities for decarbonization, especially the acceleration of renewable energy in all the other infrastructure sectors. How, for example, we move into more decentralized renewable generation systems like solar, wind, biomass. There are opportunities in water, in transport to install those systems so that we can take the pressure and the cost of the electricity grid that has to be decarbonized anyway. Okay, I'm changing a slide. I know it's quite complicated, this one, so bear with me. So now what I would like to take you through are some, if you like, practical steps of how you go about to develop a carbon neutrality or net zero strategy and plan, irrespective of which organization you are. You could be a city, like the mayor's office. It could be an asset owner, like it may be a utility, or even a developer. So we talked about the operating environment for net zero or carbon neutrality. And there are two main strands to it. So the first thing you need to be aware of is you need to understand, of course, where your emissions are, your carbon emissions, and what infrastructure you would need to build to plan for in order to decarbonize. For example, in the transport sector, we're talking about we need to electrify vehicles and fleet, and so them to be powered by renewable energy or hydrogen or other fuels that are not fossil fuels, are not petrol. So there are opportunities in an asset portfolio, or installing renewable energy systems. For example, this is a type of infrastructure we need to plan for. Also, if there is any land in your asset portfolio, you could explore options of doing land use changes for removing carbon from the atmosphere. But even if we know we need to plan for new things, to build new things, but it's equally important when we're planning to build new things is to build them right. What does this mean? This links back to the point of carbon as a proxy for resource efficiency. So when we're talking about planning for new infrastructure, buildings or roads or water treatment plants, we need to be careful in how we select alternative low carbon materials, different construction practices, more energy efficient technologies that we will need. And this is the work from the Infrastructure Carbon Review that you can access free online if you want to, but also the standard that Peter mentioned, past 2080, which is something that I was involved in co-authoring, and it gives you a process of how you go about reducing those emissions, and I'm going to take you through some of those concepts. It's very, very important, even if you are planning to do all these things. It's very important to note, and this is something I've seen also in the UK, but also other parts of the world like North America, Middle East, Southeast Asia, that you have to have the right regulatory environment in order to allow the transition to net zero, but also to incentivize you to reduce the carbon. And this is the work that Peter also gave us a great summary on of what's happening in the European Union. Okay, I'm changing a slide now. Hold on. I don't know, there is a bit of a delay, so bear with me. It's important also when we're talking about decarbonization that it's not only the technical solutions that you need to think of. It's not only what technologies I'm going to have and embed in my program of work. There are some important technical components, which are the technologies. There are important processes and tools, like how do you measure the greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon in your assets or your capital plan. But there are very, very important behavioral aspects around leadership, around governance. And these are all the things that PAS 2080 is talking about to give you a simple recipe, if you like, for how to go about reducing carbon. And I'm moving to the next slide. And finally, one of the important points are the incentives and the alignment of objectives. So what this graph shows, this is again from the Infrastructure Carbon Review, it shows the value chain for delivering infrastructure or the built environment. So you're going from the government, regulators, you have obviously the voters, the consumers, you have the asset owners, the investors, the rest of the supply chain, designers, contractors, product material suppliers. In order for carbon emissions to be reduced, it's very, very important for all these players to have common objectives and challenge each other. So for example, obviously the asset owners are key to this, to ask for low carbon from the supply chain, but the regulator needs to also put the right systems and incentives in place in order to make this happen. So alignment of objectives and incentives is going to be key. It's a very important enabler. Okay, and I'm changing the slide now. So here, what I would like to give you, if you like, a summary of the main dimensions that we have looked at in Mount McDonald when we're helping colleagues and clients to develop their own decarbonization plans. So we talked about different solutions. So how do we go about following the hierarchy that I talked about earlier? What are the technical solutions for reducing demands? This could be technologies, could be user behaviors like water efficiency, or whether the users of transport, we encourage them to use different modes of transport. What are the innovations in this space that we can bring from different parts of the world? And how can we go about changing the way of managing our land to remove those emissions or purchase offsets from the carbon market? There are some important enablers I talked about, which are the leadership has to be there in all organizations and across the value chain, the governance, and how to embed carbon on decision making. You need to have the right quantification tools, and we have been working, we have very good experience and have our own quantification tool for carbon in all infrastructure sectors and the built environment, the MOATA Carbon Portal. That it's important to have those tools to understand where the carbon is, but also how do we align the value chain and the behaviors. And finally, it's important to see the main movers and key considerations when we're going about developing a plan, which are the systems thinking I talked about earlier, that we always need to know and understand what could be our contribution from our asset portfolio, our sector, into the wider decarbonization agenda, especially when we're talking about cities where everything is interlinked. What are the behaviors of the consumers that we could influence and change so they can, for example, travel less or consume less? And what are the non-technical but nature-based solutions that we could look at to have co-benefits for removing carbon from the atmosphere? And I'm moving to the next slide now. It's very, very important, the message of starting early. What does this mean? So when we're planning for new projects, either at city scale or an asset owner in infrastructure, and we have the delivery process of strategy, brief, concept design, detailed design, construction, operation, it's important to recognize, similarly to cost, that the ability to influence any reductions is maximum at the beginning before we have designed anything or built anything. So during that planning phase, it's important to think, when we're planning for new projects, do we actually need to build this, or can we manage with different demand management measures, or can we reuse existing assets and improve their condition? Can we use alternative materials in Build Clever? Or can we use alternative construction techniques that have lower emissions in Build Efficiently? So it's very, very important, in order to maximize those benefits, to consider at carbon reduction early before you go into individual projects of work and programs of work. And I'm changing slide here. I just want to give you a quick summary of how practically you could go about making a decarbonization plan. And this is based on our approach. We have developed a process of doing that. So we have at the top, let's see, I hope you can see there is a bit of an animation. Okay, so we have at the top the different stages. So you need first to scope out and to define what your carbon neutrality or net zero scope is. For example, what is the boundary? Are you planning to do this for a whole city or your asset portfolio? This is the system boundary and the scope of emissions. You need to understand the context of what you're trying to do and what stakeholders you need to involve early. This is very, very important. And to do that, you need to understand where the carbon is. Like we say, develop a baseline. You need to quantify where your emissions are, your capital operational user, using tools that are available also in the market. As I said, we have also some great tools in-house that we have been using, in order to understand, okay, and communicate where the carbon is and how do we find the right opportunities in the hotspots, as we call them, the carbon hotspots, to decarbonize, being renewable energy, or the more detailed development of a strategy, and what are the solutions and costs and benefits of different options like solar, wind, alternative materials, electrified vehicles, hydrogen, renewable heat, all these things can be done under different options. And then obviously it's very important to engage again with your stakeholders and get their feedback. And this is where you have a net zero strategy for energy and for other emissions. And this is something we have done for many sectors in the economy, for cities, for example, but also for water utilities and transport utilities. I've been working in many projects
energetice. A já jsem se na tom podílela jak v Velké Británii, v Austrálii, na Novém Zélandu,
especially in the last
Sydney
couple
a
of years
podobně.
due to
Věnovala jsem
changes
se
in
tomu
legislation
několika
around carbon neutrality
letech z důvodu snah o dekarbonizaci.
plans for some help with those plans.
Celá řada
I'm
podniků nás
changing
žádala
the
o
slide
radu
now.
v
And it's very, very
vypracovávání
important,
plánu dekarbonizace.
this slide, but it shows
Na
basically
tomto
is
slajdu
from an extract from a piece of work I was
je to
involved
vlastně
recently.
ukázka z
And it's
pracovního dokumentu, který jsem vypracovala v poslední době. A
it's the
ukazuje
importance
různé
of carbon
cesty,
neutrality. So if this is your end goal, for example,
po
there are
cestě
different ways to get there.
uhlíkové
You could have, for
neutrality.
example, more a faster acceleration of technology solutions like renewable energy, or you could prioritize demand management measures from your users,
Třeba tu cestu
how they
popírat
are more
snižování
efficient in their
poptávky.
consumption.
Je jasné, že tam je vždy
And
nejistota,
you
co se
develop
týče
different
výsledků trhu
scenarios
a
to
je
get
možné
there.
vypracovat
So you
různé
are
scénáře, jak
monitoring
se
your
dostat
progress
k
as
tomu
we're going.
kýženému
And we have
cíli.
a methodology in McDonald of how
Společnosti
we
Mott
deal
McDonald
with
používají
uncertainty
metodiku,
in the
jak
future. We have a
postupovat
toolkit
k
called
tomu cíli.
Futures,
Máme
and
takzvaný toolkit,
it can
který
help
může
us visualize
pomoci
different potential futures and
vizualizaci
different
jednotlivých
pathways
kroků
to
a
get there. And
jednotlivých
this also
cest
includes
k
the
tomu cíli.
decarbonization.
Snapshot.
And this is a snapshot of
A
our
to je
carbon portal, our
ukázka
Moata Carbon
takzvaného
Portal, which is basically
portlu,
a
která se
database, a
vlastně
tool that we have
týká
developed in our
sektoru
suite of
budovy
digital tools.
v rámci
And we have
programu
collected data
nástrojů
from infrastructure and built
EU.
environment over
Tento portál
the last 10 years.
využívá
And we
data
have been
z
using it
různých
in our
projektů
projects.
a
Our
naši
designers, engineers, planners have
designéři a
been using
projektanti
those to quantify where the greenhouse
používali
gas emissions
pro
are and what
počítání
options are
jednotlivých
best to
možností
move forward
v
when it
rámci
comes to
různých
helping our
investičních
clients plan for their capital investment plans.
investičních projektů.
And yeah, I'm happy to talk about this in more detail. It's an online digital tool.
Nástroj dostupný na internetu.
So it's very, very important here. I wanted to summarize some key, if you like, messages around what practical things we need to do, building on what I mentioned just now. The messages. It's important to never forget the importance of leadership and governance. So without leadership at all levels in an organization, not only the government or regulators, but all our organizations we work in, we need to have the belief that we want to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions to reduce our transition risk in the future, because as Peter mentioned, investors have been already asking for disclosing of climate risks and carbon reduction opportunities. It's important to engage the right stakeholders at the right time, as I mentioned earlier. But most importantly, it's important to set your own target, trajectory, and measurement using the right tools to understand where the carbon is in your organization and plan programs of work. And finally, it's important to acknowledge that there are different pathways to net zero or carbon neutrality. There is not one future, so it's important to look at your strategy and incorporate those different pathways. Okay, next slide now. This is also, again, if you want, you can go to our website. This is the suite of digital tools we have got in our Mata platform, digital enablers. Some of them are related to carbon, but there are others that are related to optimizing designs, depending on which infrastructure sector you are, or natural solutions and environmental and social solutions. Okay, I'm changing slide. And now I just want to give you a bit of a flavor of practically how we went to become a carbon neutral company globally in Mott McDonald. Although we're a consulting organization, we have many, many offices across the world. You see the blobs here. We have been using our digital tools to understand where our carbon emissions are from our offices and our travel operations. You see some figures here. it was very, very important. I'm changing slide here. So quantification has been key for us. It has been very, very important for us to set targets and clear reduction plans. So you can see our carbon footprint per employee has been reducing over the years. And it's really, really important to set milestones. And this is the same applicable for you as well. It's very important to set a clear target and a trajectory going forward to reduce as much as possible the emissions before we go about the technological engage with our procurement of electricity in our offices to switch to renewable supply of electricity. And here, for example, there is a certificate around that. So at least we consume only renewable supply of electricity. And finally, any emissions we could not reduce, and we're actively trying to, from travel efficiencies and office supplied by renewable energy. We looked at the offsets market, as we call it. These are from removals to purchase a certificate and invest in a project that removes emissions from the atmosphere. And we chose a peatland restoration project that Mont McDonald also has been involved in its development. That's in Indonesia. And we worked very closely with the project developers to see how we can be involved in a very credible way. And this is the offset. So this is equivalent to when, for example, some of you want to purchase a flight online and they say, do you want to offset your emissions from this flight? And they give you those offset credits. But this, in our case, we were involved more extensively to understand fully what this project was about that we're claiming and investing in the offsets for. Okay. I think I'm not gonna go through all the case studies. All I'm gonna do here, because you can look at them at your own leisure. What I've summarized in this slide are a few things that we have been putting out there on thought leadership online. You can access these things online around the infrastructure. And we have done this very recently, a very good piece of work on net zero carbon heat and how you decarbonize heat, especially for buildings, very applicable to your own country, but also how do we follow practical steps to do net zero or carbon neutral infrastructure. And I think that's it from me. Apologies, I didn't want to take too much of your time. That are a good short flavor of what other things are happening and what I've seen from my experience in the UK and other parts of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, very much. It was very useful for me also to go through all this, again. And thank you for your practical insights, you give into this presentation. As we are running out of the time, I just want to remind listeners that they are able to lay questions, that they are able to put forward questions, and that we are able then to respond to after this webinar. I would like to, at the end, just to summarize the results of this webinar. It was an informative webinar, so it was about give you some key information about the challenge of carbon neutrality in your cities and towns, but also for industrial enterprises which will face the same challenge. Carbon will become very important in financial decisions and investment decisions. So we hope that we showed you how this could be achieved in the future with a couple of examples. And it is clear that the regulation of the European Union will pave the way and will push forward low carbon economy in the future. So I think it's important to start thinking about this. There could be hard decisions. It's important to focus on energy efficiency and on having some plan how to do it. If you do not know where you are going, you'll probably get somewhere else. So it is important to bear this in mind. About sustainable energy and climate adaptation plans at the Pact of Mayors initiative. I think this is the starting point for various towns to look at how they can achieve carbon neutrality in the future. This plan is very much popular in some countries. So these sustainable energy and climate adaptation plans are very popular, in particular in Belgium, where there are already 337 signatories. In the Czech Republic, we have only 11 signatories. What this CCAP means? It means that you can have an inventory of your greenhouse gas emissions, and you need to sign up to certain obligation to achieve carbon neutrality, carbon reductions by 2030 by 40%. And you will have pathways how to decrease your carbon footprint. But then if you have it, you have some idea about where you are going. So it is very useful tool, and I cordially recommend this tool to be used by cities and towns in the future, as they might become also instrumental to get further green and sustainable funding, either from banks, which will be also very much driven to use sustainability finance, but also to get funding from available European Union funds in the next programming period, 2021 and 2027. So thank you very much for your attention. Apologies for the technical problems that we had at the beginning of this webinar. I hope that it was useful for you. And before I hand over to my colleague Thomas Janeba to invite you to another events in the future. I would like to thank you a very nice rest of the day, and we will definitely speak about carbon neutrality again, as Thomas said, and I hope that you will be watching us further. Thank you.
Tak, a já poprosím režii, aby nás překládal do českého jazyka. Nevím, jestli už se to podařilo, ale každopádně na závěr. Na závěr, jestli mě slyšíte, poprosím další slide. Tak. Ještě jednou zkouším poprosit režii, abychom se přepli do českého.
Once again, kindly switch us into Czech.
Tak, doufám, že jsme přepnutí. Já bych vám chtěl všem poděkovat za vaši účast. Ještě jednou se omlouváme za technické problémy. Pokusíme se z nich poučit a na příště se připravíme. Příští úterý nás můžete sledovat od 9 hodin ráno, bude panelová debata na 2,5 hodiny na téma ESG, taxonomie a udržitelné financování. Budeme se bavit o tom, z čeho a jakým způsobem financovat vaše projekty. Následující úterý 13.4. proběhne informativní webinář na téma energie a budovy. A následně potom další úterý 27.4. proběhne informativní webinář na téma doprava a mobilita. Já vám děkuji moc krát za vaši pozornost, děkuji našim překladatelům, děkuji našim panelistům, děkuji našim zahraničním expertům a budu se těšit příští týden v úterý. Nashledanou. Mějte se krásně, buďte zdraví.
Vydržte, jste offline.